Please welcome back today's moderator, Victoria Samson, as she and a panel of experts discuss the challenges and opportunities in developing norms of behaviour. Please use the Q&A tab to ask your questions.
Hello, my name is Victoria Samson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation, and I'd like to thank you for coming in for the SSA Policy Forum, Challenges and Opportunities in Developing Norms of Behavior. The future of global space governance is moving outside of traditional arenas and responses to questions of global concern. The international community has made very little progress when trying to get results from multilateral discussions on issues that affect the security and stability of the space domain. The Conference on Disarmament, the branch of the UN that usually discusses space security issues, has not been able to reach consensus on its agenda, much less any of its topics, since the mid-1990s. Other workarounds within and outside the UN system have not seen much progress either. There's very little appetite amongst the US and its allies to develop new legal instruments. Additionally, the international community does not agree as to what the biggest threat to space security is. The US and its allies tend to view it as almost an environmental issue: clutter, both physical and electromagnetic, and congestion. Meanwhile, Russia and China and their allies tend to focus on banning actual weapons on orbit. It is hard to get forward momentum on governance of a shared domain when the major players do not even agree as is what is creating the need for that governance. The secret then might be to shift tactics and strive to make progress on establishing common understandings of what is responsible and what is irresponsible behavior in orbit. Therefore, developing norms of behavior for space activities is widely viewed as an important step towards increasing the safety, stability, and security of space activities. But there have been challenges in translating the desire for norms into concrete proposals and actual changes in behavior. This panel will discuss the value of norms of behavior for national security, civil and commercial space activities, and steps that can be taken both in the United States and abroad to create and enforce future norms. So with that, I'd like to start with my first panelist, Brigadier General Richard Zillman, who's the Deputy Director of Strategy, Plans, and Policy Directorate in the U.S. Space Command. General Zillman, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hey, thank you much for that, Victoria. So good morning, good afternoon, depending on your Zoom location today. Thanks again, Victoria, for introducing our panel members and also moderating the panel today. I'm looking forward to the discussion as well as listening to the remarks from the panel mates. To the Advanced Maui Optical and Space Surveillance Conference, thanks for the invitation to speak here today and also for your Herculean effort to actually fight through the challenges of COVID-19 to advance the discussion on norms of responsible behavior. We have a good cross-section of expertise on the panel today, and I've had the pleasure of meeting my panel mates virtually, with the exception of Bruce McClintock, whom I've actually had the pleasure of meeting in person while serving as the U.S. Space Command's Deputy J5, which is Strategy, Plans, and Policy. So as you can imagine, the past couple of years have been exciting within the space operations career field within the Department of Defense. And along with all that excitement has come a lot of hard work to first establish and then advance the Joint Space Enterprise. So with the creation of a combatant command dedicated to the deterrence of conflict, the Department of Defense today is better postured to provide the focus required in the space domain. So we're just a little over a year old here at United States Space Command. And in that first year, under the command of General Raymond, we quickly built a command from the core of the Joint Functional Space Component Command, which had about 100 people, to an organization today that has roughly 540 people. And then just last month, General Dickinson assumed command of United States Space Command, which allows General Raymond to focus on his duties as the Chief of Space Operations and the leader of the Space Force. And so speaking of Space Force and Space Command, I said both those terms in the span of 30 seconds. And so I'd like to take every opportunity I can to explain the difference between the two, because there is actually some confusion in the media today. So Space Force is like the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marine Corps. They're all military services with the mission of organizing, training, and equipping servicemen and women to support combat operations. Space Command, of which I'm a member, consists of servicemen and women from all services and is responsible for military operations in space. So to recap, Army guy on your screen, I work in the United States Space Command. So within our organization, there are three main directorates that I think are germane to the panel discussion today. The J2, which is intelligence, the J3, operations, and the J5, which I'm in, the strategy, plans, and policy. So the J2, they watch potential adversaries, and they develop a collection plan to determine what objects exist in space, what they're doing, and essentially what capabilities they possess. That's a little bit different than space situational awareness that we've known in the past. The J3 operations, they conduct operations to provide space capabilities to the Department of Defense forces in the time of conflict and in peacetime. And they also provide space services to the greater public, usually free of charge. So in particular, I would note the GPS constellation, which is most assuredly providing the timing source today so that we can all participate in this Zoom session. But also, we provide space and terrestrial weather information, access to the U.S. Space Catalog of resident space objects, and many of you are familiar with that through spacetrack.org. So in the J5, strategy, plans, and policy, we plan for all kinds of contingencies, just like the rest of the combatant commands, everything from violent extremist organizations up to and including peer adversary conflict. Interestingly, though, the very first planning effort to cross the finish line was the pandemic influenza and infectious disease. It really wasn't our choice, but that was the first one across the finish line. More interesting to the audience today, however, is the work that the J5 does with space situational awareness sharing agreements. Today, the Department of Defense has over 120 of those agreements in place with commercial, academic, and nation states to provide access to services beyond those available free of charge via spacetrack.org. And in the last year, our first year, we've completed 20 more of those agreements. And while Space Command today provides these services to improve safety of space operations, we're excited to see how the Department of Commerce can advance spaceflight safety with the innovation inherent in our commercial sector. We've all seen how rapidly the space domain has changed as the price point to entry has declined, and we know that the entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well. As the Department of Commerce assumes the space situational awareness mission, Space Command will continue to monitor the location of objects in orbit. However, our focus is going to switch to space domain awareness. This shift is necessary to protect Americans' access to space and to protect the American way of life. The shift to space domain awareness is an unfortunate result of the development of capabilities by potential adversaries to hold U.S. assets in space at risk. The space domain is no longer benign. It is a warfighting domain. And Space Command, the 11th Combatant Command, has a mission to deter conflict and, if necessary, defeat aggression. As a warfighter, I know full well the uncertainty of war. A mishap becomes a misunderstanding, which then leads to miscalculation. This is where the subject of today's panel fits into my remarks. We have been in a relatively stable domain for several decades. However, the stability is giving way to instability. Fortunately, we have been able to learn from other domains, air, maritime, and land, to help inform frameworks to reduce the instability in the space domain. A normative framework of responsible behavior allows military encounters in the domain to proceed without escalation. And so I'd like to use the maritime domain as an analogy. In the maritime domain, the stakeholders include the scientific community, the international commerce folks, and the military, ostensibly to protect sea lanes, ensure freedom of access, etc. It took the maritime community hundreds of years to develop the unwritten rules of the road. And it took the air domain roughly 50 years. It remains to be seen how long it will take the space domain to develop those unwritten rules of the road and increase our stability. Today, we have an opportunity to demonstrate behaviors that we think are responsible, which eventually will become our unwritten rules of the road. And as simple as that sounds, the establishment of norms of responsible behavior allows our J2, the intelligence team, to focus their collection efforts and permit the J3, the operations team, to more readily ascertain whether actions are threatening or not. All of us have a role to play in the establishments of norms of responsible behavior, and I charge all of you, from your respective stakeholder position, to assist in the development of these rules of the road. I look forward to the remarks of my panel mates answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General. Next, we'll be hearing from Jessica West, who's a senior researcher with the Project Ploughshares. Jessica?
Okay, hi everyone, thank you. This is my first time participating at an AMOS conference. I'm trying my best to feel as though I'm in Hawaii, even though I'm stuck in actually really chilly weather in Canada, which is unfortunate. So I'm coming at this topic of norms of behavior from a focus on arms control and conflict prevention. And on the surface, it might seem that that puts me directly opposite Brigadier General Zillman. The reality is that we share many of the same objectives, and I think both have a common interest in how norms of behavior can help make space more stable and more secure. For those of you who don't follow multilateral arms control discussions, I think Victoria did a great job of bringing us up to speed, and I would summarize it by saying that it's not working, and it's been like that for roughly 4 decades. But the level of threat in the space environment, the amount of instability is growing. It's changing quickly, particularly as it becomes a focus of war fighting, and so clearly we need to do something different. At the same time, I think there's a genuine interest from within the security sector to try to mitigate some of the uncertainties and the uncomfortable scenarios in outer space that we're faced with today, using better and more clear rules of behavior. And as we heard yesterday, there's also been considerable momentum in recent years to develop best practices for safety and sustainability in outer space. This has taken place both at the United Nations and really importantly among commercial operators as well. So to me, this is our opportunity to do something different. With funding from the Canadian Department of National Defence to do some policy research, I've been working with a defence colleague to use this momentum and identify ways in which we can further develop norms related to military and security activities in space. I like to think of it as using safety and sustainability as sort of a backdoor into security governance at a time when little else has been working. So how are we doing this? Well, we started with a survey of global space experts to probe the relationship between safety and sustainability practices and prevailing military practices in outer space. We received detailed comments from over 100 individuals from 15 different countries. To anyone in the audience who contributed to this process, thank you very much. It was tremendously helpful. We used the feedback to refine our assumptions and help identify the types of activities that we may want to influence going forward, as well as some existing practices that might be informative. And at the end of my talk now, I'll put the link to that report in the chat because I don't have time to go into the details. What I can tell you is that right now, the next step of the project is developing a map. I call it a map. I'm still working on exactly what it's going to look like, but I'm trying to visualize the existing normative landscape in outer space and to use that as a guide to the future. And think about ways in which we can take what we have and expand on it. This involves extensive coding of the existing documentation related to outer space activities and governance writ large. And I have a slide that I'm hoping can be put up to give you a glimpse of what this looks like. We'll see if that comes up. Oh, it did. Okay. Oh. So this is just, I have actually many slides, but here's one that I can share with you. So I've spent a lot of time in the last few weeks and months collecting the types of materials that inform and reflect existing practices in outer space. And as you can see from the chart, we've been looking at international treaties, national laws, adopted guidelines, as well as international standards, prevailing practices, and proposed initiatives. And to code this material, I've been reading these documents with an eye to what they can tell us about the values and purposes that are embedded in space governance documents, the types of activities that are involved already in the rules that we've set, any expected behaviors or practices that they can point to, and the kinds of tools or mechanisms that are used to make these practices work, because I think that's an important part of the behavior puzzle. And as you can see from the coding bubble chart to the right, the result is a mess. Just kidding. In fact, there's a lot of persistent themes that are emerging from the research that I believe we can use to inform better security practices. Some that stand out in the bubble chart right now are increasing use of notification and focusing on non-harmful interference and non-contamination. So the final step of this project involves a virtual workshop in early November. We're going to use that opportunity to take our map of existing norms and try to tease out concrete ways to apply it in a security and military context. In the meantime, though, I've learned a lot from the project, and I'm eager to share some of the surprises that stand out, some things that I wasn't expecting. The first is related to values. Going into this work, I was expecting that most existing agreements would reflect values linked to safety and sustainability, and that is certainly there, but when I started to code for this, I was really surprised to see how consistently conflict prevention and arms control emerged as a core purpose and goal. And I think this is clearly a priority for the international community, and it has been for a long time, so we should get going on it. The second surprise is just how much work this project ended up being. I didn't expect to find such an extensive array of documentation linked to space-related behaviors and practices. I'm part of a global refrain of voices constantly calling for more governance, new rules, new norms, and it's refreshing to realize that we have a pretty solid baseline that we can work with, given the will. And there's even a few norms specifically related to military activities and arms control that I think we can better articulate and reinforce, if not build on. And finally, I've had to grapple with the reality that not all norms are good norms. And this really came out of the survey comments. Norms can be used to legitimize bad behaviors or make good enough behaviors acceptable. Some examples that came out in comments on the survey were the testing of anti-satellite weapons, and poor or sort of wishy-washy compliance with debris mitigation standards in some cases. And I think this challenge of negative norms really means that we can't not be engaged on this topic. So I'm so glad to see it highlighted at this conference. As I said last week at the Sustainability Summit, the impact of doing nothing is not nothing. And the things that we fail to do or our silences also become norms, and they shape expectations and they influence future behaviors. This can be really difficult to change later on. So I'm glad to see so many people engaged here today. If anyone is interested in learning more about the project or participating in the workshop, please reach out. But I'm really keen to hear what others have to say on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Great. Before I announce the next speaker, I'd like to remind the audience that we are accepting questions for Q&A. So please feel free to send them in as you think of them as they come up. We'll definitely have some time at the end to really dig into some of the comments we've been hearing today. So with that, I'd like to move on to our next speaker, who is David Edmondson, Policy Head, Space Security and Advanced Threats for the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. David?
Thank you, Victoria. And good evening to everybody on the call. Really nice to see so many people on this. I'm just going to very quickly go through what we think of we're trying to achieve from the resolution that we're running at the United Nations General Assembly. But I think I will walk you through from first principles if that's acceptable to everybody, because there's something here just to understand a little bit about how this fits into what Jessica has talked about in terms of sort of the disarmament structures being stuck. And also why a UN resolution should be of interest to this conference. It's really the context in which the whole space enterprise sits and trying to maintain the space environment as being open for commerce to use, militaries to use, for our civil programs, but also so that we can think about where SSA, for example, sits within the behaviors piece and allows us to work to understand better what we're thinking about in terms of intent and behaviors, and how that then leads into understanding and miscalculation, as was introduced earlier as a concept. So space behaviors matter when we're thinking about things like close approach, when we're thinking about the threats that exist out there. Why do we care about space systems? To prevent conflict, to protect our military systems, including strategic ones, to avoid the weaponization of space if we can, and to make sure that other nations are aware of their dependence on space systems and basically get them interested in this work. A lot of you will know about the capability developments that are out there, but it's very hard to define, to verify what's on the satellite once it's up, but we can see what the satellite is doing, and that's why SSA is so important to us in all of this. We talk about responsible behaviours and how we would use them when we feel threatened, basically. That's what we're interested in. It's hard to define a behaviour, and perhaps that's the point. So I'll give you an example, the too close example. As an operator, you want to avoid collisions, but you feel threatened by a satellite that might be too close to you, or by a capability. So if the capability is a missile, then too close is the distance that corresponds to your response time. So sort of launch to bang, if you like, and that varies. If the capability is something more exquisite, then perhaps it's the range of that capability in orbit. So we can't say it's a distance. We as diplomats are interested in the concept of too close and the concept of perceived threat, rather than trying to define those absolutely. So we've thought long and hard about how we present this, and it's a fluffy solution to a problem that lots of people think can be solved by a rule. And essentially we want to enable conversations. So the UN resolution is going to the General Assembly. It's not a Security Council resolution. We've done lots of international work. So the resolution is political. It's shaping for now. And so it's currently being discussed in Geneva with colleagues there leading for us. And it will essentially try and build a momentum so that when it's presented at the United Nations General Assembly First Committee in New York in October, that it will have that momentum behind it. It will have that core group of nations able to support it and to get it over the line. Just for those of you who don't deal with the United Nations General Assembly on a daily basis, which I hope is 98 or 99% of you, because it's taking up an awful lot of my life, and doesn't need to take yours, but the General Assembly discusses questions or matters within the scope, and it makes recommendations. So this is not a Security Council resolution. As I said, it's not trying to define in itself what these behaviours should be. What the resolution does do is it calls for nations to submit national reports to the United Nations Secretary General, in practice probably the United Nations Office on Disarmament Affairs, and basically ask nations to think of three things. One, what are the threats? Two, what could you do in terms of discussing how to mitigate, manage, respond to those threats? And then three, how could we actually have a conversation going forwards to solve the things that we've just said are problems? That UN Secretary General report will then form the basis for further discussions, and we can take the useful bits out of it into the disarmament world. And obviously where those parts are more risks or hazards, we will take that work into either the long-term sustainability guidelines, sort of 2.0, the next step on those, or into the legal subcommittee or the scientific and technical subcommittee of the Committee of the Peaceful Usage of Outer Space in Vienna. So we need to get lots of nations on board. We need to get the numbers basically to get this thing through. General Assembly resolutions are difficult things. They are worse this year because we are not going to be in New York to try and influence and get this thing over the line. But I hope you wish us luck. And I'm very pleased to say that so far there's been an awful lot of support, including from the US, France, Australia, others, Japan, who have been really closely involved in helping us to define this thing. And well, I hope get it right. And you should see the final version of the resolution in the next couple of weeks. On which note, I'll hand back to Victoria.
Thank you, David. Good luck with resolution. Really hoping that it bears fruit. Our last speaker is going to be Bruce McClintock, who's the lead for the Space Enterprise Initiative of RAND. Bruce?
Thank you very much, Victoria, and the AMOS organizers for the chance to be a part of this important discussion about space norms. And I am happy to see all of my colleagues again. It's been a pleasure working with all of you in the past. I personally believe that this topic is one of the most important aspects of space policy that we'll address in the coming decade. I reference that longer term because, as you heard earlier, it took quite a while to develop normative behaviors in other domains, and space is no different. And for those that have studied the history of space norms, we know, as Jessica said earlier, and Victoria as well, this is not a new conversation. However, the circumstances in which we are talking are new, and they create greater urgency for action. General Zillman mentioned that in his comments, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. But let me begin by framing my remarks and explain why RAND is part of this conversation now. As Victoria mentioned, I'm the lead for the Space Enterprise Initiative, which is RAND's effort to connect space-related ideas and people. Some of you may know that RAND has an extensive history of significant research related to space. In fact, RAND's first report, published in 1946, was titled Preliminary Design of an Experimental World-Circling Spaceship. At that time, RAND not only correctly predicted the launch of the first satellite 11 years in advance, it made some prescient observations about how public thinking would be affected by early space operations. We all know today that the public reaction to Sputnik and the concern over nuclear attack eventually led to a space race. More importantly for our discussion, it was a related fear of a surprise attack from the Soviet Union, a lack of knowledge or access to the Soviet heartland, and initial reports from the RAND Corporation about the capability of reconnaissance satellites that led President Eisenhower to prove an effort to establish the international law principle of freedom of space. 7 decades later, RAND is still conducting extensive space-related research for and with a wide variety of not just US, but international partners and organizations. More recently, RAND began to consider the broader topic of space power. And this year, we undertook a preliminary analysis to better understand the current state of global space governance. In the subset of norms of behavior, RAND developed some preliminary hypotheses for investigation. Let me briefly summarize those suppositions now. First, the discussion of global space governance has spanned the entire era of spaceflight, but has been mostly stagnant for the last 2 decades, with some exceptions. Jessica even extended that out to 4 decades. Second, due to the explosive growth of space operations, operational and economic vulnerabilities to space hazards are growing. Space debris is one well-known hazard example. Third, given the extensive global dependence on space, it is in everyone's interest to advance norms and responsible behaviors as part of a broader global space governance effort. Fourth, the power to conceive and design space norms and global space governance systems is no longer the purview of a small number of great space powers. This effort must include leaders from all space sectors, to include international actors at all levels of space maturity, commercial sector leaders, and civil players. And with a quick shout out to Quentin for his opening remarks today. I wasn't able to hear all of them, but I thought it was very interesting that we're coming at this from 2 sides. He is saying that this kind of debate and discussion cannot go forward without the inclusion of the great space powers militaries. Our supposition is the flip side of that, which is it cannot just be about great powers and their militaries and their national security apparatuses. It has to be the entire space enterprise. So with these 4 propositions in mind, to begin evaluating them, RAND convened a series of responsible space behavior workshops with senior subject matter experts from all space sectors. Now, the workshops were invitation-only events, and they're conducted under the Chatham House rule to protect the privacy of the participants and to make sure they spoke with utmost candor. In advance of the workshops, we asked our participants to provide written responses and come prepared to discuss 3 questions. What problems are we trying to solve? Why haven't we solved these problems before? And where should we go from here? Now, we're still analyzing the written and discussion responses to the questions, so it's too early to draw any specific conclusions, but some interesting insights are already emerging. Overall, the participants agreed that there is a wide array of problems to address, and the growing complexity of the space domain is increasing the need for tangible progress. We've heard other panelists comment on that as well today. Given the wide array of information that we were given, at RAND we grouped the problems into a few key areas. debris, space traffic management, operations, safety, security, and stability. Now, there were very diverse views about what problems are most important, ranging from the growing risk of orbital debris to the need to break the logjam of various failed international efforts. Both are comments that have been echoed at this event, not just this panel. Before we even asked our second question, it was clear that the diversity in perspectives among participants reinforced the hypothesis that there's a lack of a common view on the issue of norms, let alone the concept of global space governments. When we did ask, why haven't we solved these problems before, there was again a wide range of responses that we have grouped as follows: lack of issue awareness, lack of common interests, and various barriers to cooperation and compliance. A few brief examples, and we can talk about more during the Q&A. First, the historic record clearly demonstrates an overall lack of progress in the international venues, usually due to competing interests. That's been echoed by some of the other panelists as well. But it's important to note that this lack of common interest is also reflected in nation-state behavior over the last 30 years especially. For example, at least one analysis of global space operations notes that the biggest issue in LEO is associated with the very low, and that's defined as less than 50% compliance with the 25-year rule. For a more recent example, we can consider and perhaps discuss the case of small sats. Now, this led us to our final question: where should we go from here? Here we summarize the answers and discussions in the following areas: increase communications and engagement, select a few achievable first steps, start with bilateral agreements and like-minded partners, then look for ways to build greater buy-in. Some examples of increased communications include efforts like what David described earlier. Achievable first steps included proposals for greater overall transparency, similar to what Brigadier General Zillman mentioned, and even discussions about SSA data sharing. Some participants even proposed a ban on debris causing ASAT testing. Now, it's much too early for RAND to draw any conclusions or recommendations, other than to agree that greater communications and engagement is a necessary first step to progress. To conclude, it's clear that there's a lot of history and room for improvement in the focused area of developing norms of behavior, let alone the broader area of global space government. RAND, which functions as an independent entity from all government agencies and our various international partners, looks forward to being a part of the solution. With that, I'll turn it back to Victoria and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Bruce. Okay, I'd like to thank all my panelists for sticking to their time limit, so we actually have time to have some Q&A. We're getting quite a few questions in from the audience, but I'm going to take the moderator's right to ask the first few. You know, one of the things that I hear a lot from people when we talk about norms of behavior is that, well, how do they handle bad actors? So just for the panel, how do norms handle threats posed by actors with bad intent? Anyone who wants to take that, please. Jessica.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. And I like this question because I think we're going to give you different answers based on where we're sitting in the space governance puzzle. So I'm sitting in civil society. A key contribution that I would argue civil society makes to governance and to security is by calling out bad behavior as part of a contribution to accountability. And that happens in all kinds of activities around the world. It's hard to do in space. In space, there's a lot of finger pointing, there's a lot of he said, she said, but when you're sitting in civil society and trying to be objective and trying to be a voice for what is good behavior and what is bad behavior, it's challenging when we don't have agreement on the basics. And to me, that would be a key way in which people like me could participate more in helping make space more stable. And I'm anticipating that this looks very different when you're coming at it from, say, a military perspective or an operational perspective.
Jessica,
Thank you, Jessica.
Bruce, can I
I'm sorry,
follow
Bruce.
up on that?
No.
Yeah, so if I may, very similar to what Jessica said, but in RAND speak, we put it in some different terms, and there are models that can be applied in this regard. And the most recent, we talked about other domains, is the cyber domain, because you always run into the problems with detection, which in the space domain is obviously about SSA. and space domain awareness, the new term that's emerging. But even after you detect something, you have to be able to characterize it, attribute it, and then ideally hold somebody to some level of consequence. That's always become the challenge, and I think your question comes to the whole point about, well, how do you hold somebody accountable for this kind of behavior? The first step is going through all those initial steps and developing a common shared understanding of the behavior, as Jessica said. I'm no longer in the military, but I'll just use as one example some of the more recent examples where the US military has, and other countries, so the United States in alignment with its partners, has highlighted what is really bad behavior on orbit. And that is the testing of ASAT systems. Just calling that out and building a public awareness is the first step to the process of actually holding somebody accountable. It's not as good as an international treaty, but it is a first step, and similar first steps have been taken in other domains.
And if I could maybe add on to some of Bruce's comments. So I think it's been pretty well known in the past year, the leadership of the United States Space Command has had the opportunity on several occasions to highlight some bad behavior, if you will. It goes back to essentially some Russian activity around U.S. platforms, maneuvering every time we would maneuver, essentially setting up a threat to that platform. Now, it's important to understand the context, right? And even if we may not agree on what should be acceptable behavior and what should not be acceptable behavior, at least over time, we get to understand how a certain actor operates in the domain. So at least then we can understand if it's abnormal behavior, even though we may consider it to be unacceptable behavior. And so I'd like to kind of highlight the difference between the space situational awareness paradigm and the space domain awareness paradigm. So on the space situational awareness side, it's really all about safety and just understanding where an object is. On the space domain awareness side, it's no longer important to know just where the object is. I need to know what it is. I need to know what it's doing. I need to know what its capabilities are. I need to know how it can hold our assets at risk. And so these behaviors that we think are acceptable or unacceptable will at least allow us to gauge some kind of intent. In the case here in the past several months, where the Russian activity is behavior that we consider unacceptable. Surely it is unacceptable. We don't like it. We told them we don't like it. But in a different context, say maybe in the context of a Cuban Missile Crisis scenario, we would have proceeded in a much different manner than we did in a peacetime environment. So I think attributing those threats is important to deterrence, so that we can positively identify that threat and then hold folks accountable for it.
Thank you. David, did you have anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think there's a little follow-on to that, really, which is particularly for the activities, the Russian activities that were mentioned just now. Their response to this, of course, was we have broken no rules. And so part of the work that we're doing on norms is to say, in future, well, actually, you have. Because you can't even have a conversation with an actor if they don't agree what is a responsible behavior and what is an irresponsible behavior. The starting point is the definition. So even before you get to any thought of consequences, as was mentioned, you need the whole process of attribution, but you need to attribute against something. So the idea of norms is just the start of a conversation that allows you to start pushing back. And that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you. I think that leads into one of the questions I see from the audience that I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on. The panel identified norms as being able to establish patterns and be able to call out people when they're acting in different patterns or possibly threatening patterns. The question is, how does one enforce established and agreed upon norms of behavior, and can you penalize bad behavior with norms? What is the panel's thought on this? Anyone?
I'll go first. No,
you.
you can't, because these are sovereign states and it's sovereign action. So what you're actually doing is you're taking a different. This is why this isn't a rules-based approach. This isn't about penalizing, and it's not about enforcement in that sense. It's about sovereign states talking to each other. but actually sovereign states knowing that they should talk to each other. Because at the moment, an awful lot of what goes on in space is basically nations talking past each other, if they're talking at all. So how and maybe even why would you enforce some of these norms in a penalty system when what you actually want to do is make it so that it's not worthwhile for the other state to even think about undertaking the activity? Because at the end of the day, that's the win. If you pre-constrain the activity so that it never happens.
Thank you. Bruce.
Sure. Thanks for that, David. And David's absolutely correct. At the international law level, the one kind of perspective I'd offer, and this is a personal perspective here, is that what you may not be doing in terms of punishing somebody, you may be taking action in terms of reinforcing the inherent right of self-defense. And I'd be remiss to claim to be some kind of expert on laws of the sea, but there are examples in international waters where vessels can say, if they truly believe that they are at risk, that they can take action to defend themselves and their platform and their mission. And it may not be the best analogy, I defer to our military expert here, but the whole concept of how US vessels kept small inflatable vessels at a distance, at a greater distance after some terrorist attacks, is an example of something where there's not an international law that says you cannot place an inflatable vessel within 200 meters of a US vessel, but the US enforced that on their own in international waters because it was a matter of inherent right of self-defense. So not so much punishment, but protecting oneself and one's capabilities. And I could be totally off base here, so I'm open to other perspectives on that.
We appreciate your humility on that one, Bruce. Other thoughts from the panel? General Zillman.
Sure, and I'm probably going to stay away from the punishment discussion as well. I don't think we can necessarily do the punishment aspect of it. What I think it highlights, though, is some of the communication requirements that we're going to require as we go through this period. So, and I had this discussion with Bruce maybe a week or so ago. And I mentioned in my opening remarks how today we are, previously we were in somewhat of a stable situation in the space domain, and we're moving toward more instability, and we have to look forward and see what that next stability point is going to be and what that environment is going to look like. And so I would posit that it's going to be large mega constellations. You're going to have ubiquitous situational awareness sensors out there to try and characterize what is on orbit, but probably still won't have enough sensors to maintain custody of everything all the time. I think you're going to have rendezvous and proximity operations that are going to be routine. And so as we go from today's state to eventually a state that is a future state that hopefully is stable, we're going to have questions on what those norms should look like. And so having some kind of a consultative mechanism, and Bruce had mentioned essentially incidents at sea, other types of maritime governing documents out there, as they have a consultative mechanism where parties can gather and say, hey, remember last year about 3 months ago when you did this? Yeah, we didn't like that for this exact reason. And it allows an exchange of ideas back and forth so that the norms get refined to hopefully what that stability point is going to be in the future.
Other thoughts? Jessica.
Yeah, I think from a punishment perspective, that's a strong word for norms, but there's certainly a downside to being perceived as not following standard norms of behavior. And I think naming and shaming and reputational risk matter. You'll see now, if you're paying attention to the news, there's a bit of jockeying going on about who is a responsible actor in space and who's not a responsible actor in space, and that's sort of coming from a variety of different perspectives. So I think the ability to name and shame and to influence people's reputation matters. But I think flipping that question around, norms are about more than sort of punishments and sticks. I think norms are really about carrots, and there's a huge carrot to being able to follow agreed upon standards of behavior, namely that you can reduce the chance that you inadvertently escalate a situation or create some other response from an actor that you really weren't wanting to do. And to me, that's a huge risk that we face right now is, I think General Zillman was speaking about that, mishaps lead to misinterpretations and can lead to escalation. And so I think a carrot is trying to stay out of these situations and make the environment itself more stable rather than necessarily punishing actors.
Thanks, Jessica. And that really leads into a question I thought was pretty thought-provoking from the audience member. There's been a lot of discussion about the need for these norms to make sure that the space domain is stable. How would you guys define, or how would you envision a stable space domain? Like, what is the end goal here? Any thoughts from the panel? Everyone's very carefully not making eye contact with the camera.
So I hopefully I don't steal some of Bruce's thunder on this, but he and I have talked about this, and I think he got it from another author. I'll leave it up to him if he wants to name him or not. But as I mentioned earlier about trying to figure out where that next stable equilibrium point is in our domain, I guess one of the things that I think will lead to that is getting to a sense of parity. If you look at some of our doctrine that we have on the Department of Defense side, we use terms like supremacy, dominance. Those are very typical military words. I don't think anyone would want their military to have the opposite of those words in their strategy. And it allows us to then to focus, more along the lines of space domain awareness to understand and characterize what those threats are doing. Unfortunately, right now we have a situation where our adversaries understand how the American way of life is dependent on the space domain, and they understand how the American way of war is dependent on the space domain. And some of that is quite honestly due to our departure from the last stability point, where space was primarily used as a strategic role, where we were trying to enable the nuclear deterrent apparatus. As we've proliferated that, the use of space into the operational and tactical domains to enable everything from precision munition to precision targeting, our adversaries have really no choice but to try and to target our access to space. So at some point we have to get, hopefully along the lines, more of a parity type approach if you want stability. As a military member, of course, I always want an unfair fight. But if you want to have the ability to get to a place where you're more stable, I think you can look at the nuclear regime and understand that when you have parity, you have a little bit more stability.
Thank you. Other thoughts from the panelists? Bruce.
Yeah, thanks to General Zillman. I'm not going to offer up an author at this stage because it's from an unpublished discussion, but to expand on the point that he's making, and I'm going to shift the term a little bit, because if we put it in the sense of this conversation we had to do a lot with kind of thinking back about how nuclear policy and arms control were developed, and how, and again, I'm speaking from the seat of an honest broker, and that's Rand, and we, if you want to put it this way, we speak truth to power, right? So sometimes our conversations are uncomfortable. We'll say things like, hey, in the future, to reach this kind of new balance point, it may be a circumstance where the United States needs to think about being in a position of parity rather than supremacy. So that's kind of the nature of the conversation that we had. But I would use the term equality here, because I would, to answer the question about, how do you define a stable space domain, it's one where there's equal rights for all. So we go back to the Outer Space Treaty, if we keep that as the foundation. So there's equal access and also equal ability to benefit from space. That's something that there's some instability about right now. And it's why we need some of these things like this discussion about norms, and I'll go so far as to say things like accountability. Because when you start to have actors that do things like test weapons that could not only affect what I'll call geopolitical security, but affect the space environment for a long time. We all have heard of Kessler syndrome and things like that. That has implications for the entire planet, not just two nations that may be sparring with each other. So if we can reach that place where we have equality and equal accountability as well, that would be a good example or a good metric for a stable space domain.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just build very briefly on something Bruce said, because I think he's rather hit the nail on the head with the two parts there. There's a geopolitical part and there's a space environment part, and the two things have to be linked. And very often they are de-linked because people think it's helpful because somehow you can carve this up and deal with one part and then the other will follow. I particularly focus on the idea that you have to do the two in parallel. It makes it very difficult. You can do things like the LTS guidelines, long-term sustainability guidelines through COPUS, and you can operate safely and you can focus very hard on the environment. But actually, when you think about the military threats and their threats to space systems, they're not just threats to space. How does space fit into strategic defense, into our deterrence posture more widely? How does space fit into our battlefield communications globally? How does space fit into our way of life economically? If you take all of these things in the round, then I think that's how you get stability in the space environment, seeing it as part of the geopolitics. Thanks.
Thank you. So one other question I wanted to go into before, as we're getting close to the end. If you, the panel, had to rank what are the most pressing issues we need norms for, what would they be? Or if you would like to pick maybe the top 3 or whatever, issues that require norms, what would you recommend them to be? Any thoughts?
So I'll volunteer. I'll be the guinea pig to go first.
Thank you again.
You know, so I guess there's 2 ways to look at this, right? And so one would be, what is the highest probability of an outcome that's serious enough that we would like to have the norms in place? And that's probably more on the safety side of the house, where we're going to have mega constellations that are going to operate. We know that there's going to be a large number of increase of satellites on orbit here in the near future, and those are we're going to have to make sure we look at long-term sustainability options for that in terms of debris that for each launch to make sure that we can mitigate those satellites. So from a probability perspective, I think you probably want to look at the safety part of the discussion first. Now the counter to that is what's the most damaging? Well, the most damaging would be is if you had some kind of a conflict that extended into the space domain. Not nearly as likely, but the outcome would be a whole lot worse. And so you could make an argument to say, well, maybe we should be looking at the security discussion of norms of behavior first, because that's the most dangerous situation.
Thank you. Jessica?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with that two-pronged approach. So the research that we're doing, the effort to map existing agreements and values in outer space, I would say that some of the low-hanging fruit that I think is urgent but also feasible would be taking steps to minimize debris in outer space. There's a variety of tacks that could be taken from that, but I would say there's a lot of bits and pieces already in place to warrant, restricting intentional creation of debris through military activities. And that would be, fruit salad is the way I described it last year, just putting those pieces together. What keeps me up at night, sort of like General Zillman said, to me, the potential for nuclear escalation through space activities. That keeps me up. COVID keeps me up, and that keeps me up, nuclear. And I've been looking through some of the historical agreements where there's efforts to stabilize that potential during the Cold War. So thinking about how we might build in protections for the satellites that are linked to command and control of nuclear forces, I think would be worthwhile.
Thank you, Jessica. Bruce, did you want to jump in here?
Sure. Couple of quick comments here because I know we're short on time. So this is Bruce's rank order, not Rand's, because we're very deliberate about our process. But I would put the most pressing issues in the following order, based not just on our workshops, but other independent work that I do to include track 2 dialogue with select Russians on strategic stability issues. So I would say the first pressing issue is communications and transparency. Just a very brief example in that regard. We still don't communicate well across all of the spacefaring nations. And General Zillman gave 120 agreements and 20 in the last year, which is fantastic. but we lack an agreement like that with Russia. We also don't have great transparency across all the different actors. And when you start having communications at these bilateral levels, not true of most nations, but some nations will claim that their data is better than somebody else's data. So just the fact that there's different levels of information out there causes, it certainly creates confusion. In the same vein, and I think David mentioned this too, and it's part of, it'll take years, frankly, to develop this, but we need to, I'm going to use a term that Quentin used earlier, semantics. We need to make sure that we work really hard on the basic definitions of what we mean when we're talking about things in the subset of norms. What does unsafe mean? What does unprofessional mean? David gave the example of how close is too close. You really can't define that because of the way orbital mechanics work, so you have to come up with other terms. What does provocative mean? That moves us in another direction. And then at least for me, the functional area that I think is most pressing is debris mitigation and reduction. So there's a lot we could talk about. I think there's a panel tomorrow, in fact, on that very subject. So those would be my top three.
Thank you. David, did you want to add any to this list?
I'll very, very briefly split it into 3 bits. So one would be on Earth. So jamming and spoofing of signals, so being the recipient, we've got to do something about that. One would be in space, so advanced capabilities, understanding what they are, and doing something that allows us to understand intent of use of those capabilities. And the other would be from Earth, and we need to do something about norms of how we use lasers and whether ASATs are acceptable. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to end with one last question, and this is kind of tying it in to the theme of this conference. The question is, do you think it is an incumbent on a nation to establish the means to provide independent validation of contested behavior prior to developing norms of behavior? And this, I guess, is where SSA really comes into the picture. What is the role of SSA for norms? And do we need to have independent assertion from various national SSA capabilities to really determine whether behavior is responsible, norms are being followed, that sort of thing? In the minute we have left, what is the panel's thoughts on this? Anyway.
20-second version, that kind of
Please.
independent verification is always preferred, but it's not practical at this stage. And even if you have that kind of independent verification mechanism, there are actors that will dispute that information. So it's the first important step is to have some means of detection, characterization, verification, and then just go with that as the first step. That's where we are now.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
So I would just say that attribution comes in 3 parts. Obviously, there's technical, which you're referring to now, but then there's also the legal and the political. So yeah, independent verification is great, but actually it's one part of a whole.
Thank you. General Zillman?
So I think this really shows how valuable all the stakeholders can be in this. And so it's very hard to hide what you're doing in space domain these days. It used to be pretty easy. And so the fact that we have the scientific community, the fact that we have other nation states that can see what is going on is a good thing, right? So the fact that things are in the open and can be attributed is beneficial. I think we would all like to have multiple folks mentioning at the same time that we don't like the irresponsible behavior.
Thank you. Jess, you want last word on this?
I have too many thoughts on this. Definitely having different perspectives is important. Independent, like state by state, I don't think so. I guess I would also point to the importance of expanding what we're talking about in terms of SSA, not just what is where, but also, pulling information about natural hazards in space, because sometimes we often just don't know why satellites malfunctioning, and being able to attribute that to a natural hazard versus something that might be done intentionally, I think is also important. And data sharing is one of the key things that we're coding for in our research.
Great, thank you, Jessica. And I would like to add, of course, that when you look talking SSA, the role of the commercial sector is absolutely important to getting a really thorough picture of the space domain, in addition to the national sources. So with that, I think we're right at time. So I would like to thank my panelists for an absolutely fascinating discussion about norms behavior. Thank you so much to the audience for tuning in. And I welcome, we're going to be signing off now, but please stick around for the rest of the conference. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Mahalo and a hui ho. Until we meet again. We thank you for sharing your time with us. We hope to welcome you to Maui for the 22nd AMOS Conference, September 14th through the 17th. Aloha.